Welcome to the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. This is episode 27. Now, in 2015, I cycled from Tarifa in Spain, that's the southernmost point of mainland Europe, to Nordkapp in Norway, the northernmost point. It took me over 100 days. In 2019, Dr. Ian Walker, who's an academic at the University of Bath, completed the journey in the opposite direction, and it took him 16 days, 20 hours and 59 minutes. In the process, he became the fastest person ever to cycle across Europe north to south. That's no mean feat for a man in his mid-forties who'd only taken up ultra-long-distance racing a few years prior to breaking the record. I needed to find out how he did it.
Yes, my name is Ian Walker. I do ultra-distance cycling for this last few years, having got into it from a long-distance running background. And I was about to say my spare time, when I'm not riding a bike, I do research as an academic on sustainability matters, but also to some extent I do research on cycling and transport matters.
I came across your name last week online because I was trying to do some research into the race that takes place between Nordkapp and Tarifa, and I was trying to encourage somebody who organises that onto the podcast, but with no luck. And then I noticed the name Ian Walker crop up, and I noticed that you'd broken the world record for cycling from Nordkapp down to Tarifa, which immediately made me think, God, this is an interesting person to talk to. But your background is more interesting than that, because you do have this dual role of being a cyclist and having done quite a lot of research in terms of cycling as well.
Yeah, and the two aspects have sort of come and gone over the years, or they've kind of twisted around each other in funny ways. So, I first really started riding a bike in any sort of way back when I was at university. I read a couple of Josie Dew books and thought, cycle touring looks really fun. And I started riding on this appalling old piece of junk mountain bike, and I graduated to something slightly better, and was just doing sort of what you might think of as classic touring, very CTC style, sit up and beg, cafes and panniers type touring. And then I sort of drifted out of that a bit after I started work, but at the same time drifted into doing research on transport and doing research on cycling as a mode of transport and doing research on cycling safety. But at the time I was doing that, I was doing a lot less actual riding in my personal life. And there was even a time where it almost felt almost fraudulent that I had all this professional experience and spent a lot of my time at work talking about cycling, and yet wasn't really doing any of it at the time. And then it's almost now gone full circle the other way, that I spend a huge amount of my spare time riding a bike these days, but actually do less research than I used to. So over the last 20 years, it's really spun round and round between the two worlds.
So getting back, before we actually go on to the stuff that you do now in terms of the cycling, just picking up on what you said about the traditional CTC kind of cycle touring, where did you get to when you first took it up? Where did you go? What kind of places did you cycle to?
Well, basically, so it started when I was at university, and I was at York, and there's good cycling around there. You've got some real options of, you can stay flat up and down the Vale of York, or you can get into the Pennines or up to the Yorkshire Wolds. So I would typically, I'd say, I got to a point where I would do maybe 70-mile trips most weekends and just go out and go somewhere. What was quite nice with that is I could actually get back home in that sort of distance. So I grew up near Burnley and could get back home from university for the weekend and in a 2-day trip. And I'd do that kind of thing, just sort of tootling along, just picking a point on a map and heading there, really.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you actually, because I listening to some of your interviews, you have a northern accent, and because I live down the Calder Valley, so not a million miles from Burnley. It's kind of over the hill. And also, when were you at York? Because I was a student at York as well.
Oh, I was there 93 to 99.
Okay, I was a little bit before that. What did you study there?
Psychology.
Ah, right. Okay.
Yes, I did a psychology degree and then stayed on and did a doctorate.
Okay, because I studied mathematics when I was there, and
Ah.
but there is you do a lot of statistical work in your research, don't you?
Yeah, well, yes, and I teach statistics as well. So that's something I sort of stumbled into, really. It wasn't necessarily my favorite thing as a student. But like a lot of new psychology lecturers, I got landed with teaching statistics and actually found I really enjoyed it and found I got on quite well with the process of teaching it. And so it became a bit of a specialism.
Right. So you kind of got into cycling with the cycle touring. You're doing your academic research. You did a PhD at York, yeah?
Yes, although it was in a very different subject, actually. My PhD was actually in sort of memory and language. So, yeah, the move into the transport research came later.
So you're now, I think you're in your what, mid-40s?
Yes.
So there's a long period there between actually doing your initial break into cycling as a cycle tourer and what you've done over the last few years. So what happened in the intervening 20 years?
There's a big question. Basically, probably the key answer to this is that I had a long period of not doing very much. So, realistically, if let's for the sake of argument say my 30s, I really wasn't doing that much physical active stuff. Every now and again, I would just have the idea to do a thing. So, for example, I at one point I was living in Salisbury at the time, and I discovered there was a 26-mile footpath to Winchester, and so I just sort of built myself up to be able to walk that path in a day and see what that was like, and then stop doing it. And another time, I thought, oh, I'd be really interested to know what it'd be like to ride 200 kilometers on a bike. And I built myself up to do it, did it once, and then stopped again. And so I went through these sort of fits and spurts of building up to doing an event or an achievement and then just stopping again. It's almost like, yeah, I've done that, checked it off. I can move on and just sit back on the sofa again. So my 30s were basically spent doing that. And then the thing that really changed was just on the verge of my 40th birthday. And, it's hard to describe this without it sounding like some sort of midlife crisis. But just at that point, a friend just sent me a video out of the blue of a running race, the Transvolcania running race in the Canary Islands. And he just said, should we do this? And it just looked incredible. And I thought, yeah, okay, yeah, let's do that. And at the time, I thought it was going to be another of these things where I would build myself up, do a thing, and then stop. But with ultra running, it turned out I'd finally found this thing that really excited me. And so I built up to it, did the event, and for the first time, didn't stop. For the first time, I carried on with that thing.
So there's a clear connection between the ultra running and the kind of cycling that you do now. What do you think is the attraction? What makes it different? What makes it such an appealing thing for you? I dare say a lot of people might disagree with you, but what is the appealing thing for you about that very long distance exercise?
I think there's a couple of things. The first is that it provides an opportunity for someone like me, who's not the most powerful athletic figure in the world, to do well. I'm not the fastest or the strongest, but I've got a good boredom threshold and I can put up with a sore backside for a long time. And, I can do well at something just through these other means. But there's another aspect of this as well, which is what I started to glimpse with the running, especially when you start doing, say, 100-mile runs that last a day or so, is there's this really interesting experience that I hadn't realized was going to happen, which is when you go into a long run like a 100-miler, there's this feeling of putting your regular life on a shelf for a period. It's like you just put aside your normal self, and for this period of 24 hours or whatever it is, you just 100% single-mindedly devote your entire existence to just doing one thing. And I really came to enjoy that. I really came to like the freedom that came with putting my normal life aside for a bit and just completely focusing on one thing. And I think one of the reasons the transition to cycling happened was I spotted, when I learned about ultra distance cycle racing, I thought, wow, there's a chance to do that same thing. There's a chance to put my life aside and focus on a thing, but not just for a day, maybe even for weeks. And it was the idea of just putting life on hold for maybe 2 weeks and just having that complete focus and dedication that really, really drew me to the cycling, to the extent that I literally just stopped running and bought a bike the next day and started cycling.
Yeah, I think most people, certainly most cyclists, can probably sympathise with that feeling, simply because when you get on a bike, and the same is when you're running, you can't do anything else. You can't fiddle with your phone. You can't read a book.
Yeah.
You can't do all these other things that we spend so much of our life nowadays distracting ourselves with things in our hands or things on a screen. When you're on a bike, you're forced not to do that. And it is actually, especially in our modern world, it is quite a nice thing to experience.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I guess what sport, ultra distance sport in particular, gives you is that opportunity in a sort of socially acceptable way to do something that is almost like meditation. It's almost like giving you an excuse to find that time and space without distraction.
You have recently written a book called Endless Perfect Circles, and that's about your cycle, your world record cycle that we'll come to in a second. But I did notice that it's subtitled My Experiences of Going from a Couch Potato to Record Breaking Long Distance Cyclist. Now, from what you've just said, is that an accurate description? You don't really sound like a couch potato.
Yeah, I think there's possibly a sense in which I was very slightly disingenuous there, but I think there's also a sense in which it's true. Like I say, I genuinely did spend most of my 30s not doing much. A typical evening was spent sitting on the sofa, eating and drinking beer. And those bursts of activity I described were not the norm. They were things that would happen for maybe 3 months and then I'd stop again. The bulk of the time was spent just really not doing any sort of physical activity.
So you've now made the decision to move from doing the running to doing the cycling. What was the first event that you entered?
That was the Transcontinental race, which was the one that just captured my imagination. And the thing that got me was, I can't remember how I saw it. Maybe it was on Twitter or something, but somebody linked to a photo essay on Strava, which is still there actually. And it was documenting the 4th edition of the Transcontinental race. And it had text and these amazing images that just conveyed the absolute mind-boggling scale of that kind of race. And it's all these images of people slumped to sleep in the corner of checkpoints and riding up astonishing mountain passes in Eastern Europe. And that essay just conveyed the enormity of the event so well that was what just immediately grabbed me and made me think, okay, yeah, this is somewhere where I can experience the scale and enormity of a sporting event that will dominate my existence for this long period of time.
Now that was in 2017, and that a lot of people will have heard of Mike Hall. I think that took place shortly after he was killed in Australia. Have you read Emily Chappell's book about long distance cycling?
I haven't yet. I have it here, and I deliberately put it aside until I'd finished writing my book because I didn't want to be influenced by another writer writing in a similar area. And then I've not yet got round to reading it, but it's high on the list.
Well, it should be, because it's a cracking read, but I have to say, after reading it's a brutal world, and it's not the greatest advert for somebody who wants to be encouraged to do that kind of ultra long distance cycling. So you say you looked at these pictures on Strava online and you thought, wow, that looks incredible. Do you think you were going into it a little bit naively, a little bit blind? Were you aware of the fact that it was such a brutal, harsh thing to do?
Yeah, I think I was, or at least I went into it anticipating that. So something I always did when I ran was I was really careful never to let myself get complacent about races. Even after I'd had good races, I always made sure I didn't get too big for my boots. And I would go into the next race telling myself, okay, the last one went well, but this is a big day out. Anything can happen. This is going to hurt. And basically, that was almost like a mantra. I went into every running race thinking, this is going to hurt. And so when I went into that transcontinental race, which was obviously going to be vastly bigger and vastly harder, I was going into it with, this is going to hurt more than anything I've done before. And I was really intimidated. I remember standing at the check-in at the start of the race in Belgium, and there was something like 300 other riders there, and I was just, it was a real sort of, not quite imposter syndrome, because I hadn't done anything at that point, but I was really daunted by looking at the other riders. Everyone was there. They all looked so fit. Everyone had these amazing shiny bikes that all looked nicer than mine. And just watching them was really intimidating. And so with all of that, with the intimidating nature of the other riders I saw, with the scale of the event that I knew was going to be bigger and harder than anything I'd ever done before, there was no sense at all in which I went into it being complacent or expecting it to be easy. So if anything, it proved to be slightly easier than I anticipated, because I did finish. I was going into it with a real feeling of, there's a damn good chance I'm not going to finish this at all. So if anything, it was better than I set myself up for.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're being a bit disingenuous there, because you actually finished 27th out of a field of, like you said, 300-400 people, a lot of whom didn't finish.
But I've got to say, that genuinely, and I know people won't believe this, but that was genuinely a complete surprise to me. I was, I had no expectations. I'd never ridden a bike before in a race. Like I said, I was really, really daunted at the start line, just watching all these other people. The only ambition I had was to finish. And the fact that I did reasonably well was genuinely a complete surprise to me.
I'm trying to visualize you there at the start of this race with all these people around thinking, oh God, I'm this is outside my comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
By the end of that race, after the 13, 14 days that you were with those people, although obviously you don't spend much time with them, did you have a very different view of that world of long distance, ultra distance cycling at the end of that 2-week period than you had when you first arrived in Belgium?
Yeah, definitely. And let me go on a very slight little tangent here. So I once, a few years ago, there was this really weird thing that happened at work where one of the UK research funding councils were doing a science communication event, and they basically set up an event where a bunch of researchers could do stand-up comedy as a way of communicating their research. And I, in my typical way, went, oh yeah, I'll do that. That sounds like fun. And we went along to a training day where a stand-up comedian came in and gave us some training. And he said, he told us all sorts of stuff about microphones and timing and things like this. And he said, now here's what will happen. You'll do your first set. You will be absolutely terrified the whole time. And the moment you step off the stage, you'll go, oh, right, now I see how you do that. And he was dead right, because stand-up comedy is really hard. But that was exactly the experience I had with the Transcontinental. I can remember sitting there at the finish line, maybe an hour or so after I'd finished, and just thinking to myself, right, okay, so that's how you do it, is it? Now I see how this works. And it was only when I stopped that it all became clear.
And what was the reaction of all these other people? A lot of them didn't finish, obviously. And there you were, this 40-something upstart person from England who managed to come 27th. What was their reaction? Were they in any way dismissive?
Oh, no. I mean, I don't think anyone noticed, to be honest. It's a big race. Everyone's welcome. Everyone's, no one's, I think, particularly surprised that some unknown person just turned up and had a go, because that's the nature of the ultra distance world, whether it's running or cycling. Both of those, I would say, are very welcoming worlds that generally, obviously there'll be exceptions, but I'd say generally both of those worlds are very accommodating and respectful to anybody who wants to rock up and have a go.
Yeah. So how long was that transcontinental in 2017?
I think it was 13 days, something. I've not actually got that to hand, but yeah, it was something like 13 days. Oh, do you mean distance? Sorry, it's about 4,000 kilometers in distance.
Right. Okay. So the following year you did something in Wales, which I'm assuming wasn't 4,000 kilometers because you can't fit 4,000 kilometers into Wales. When was the North Cape 4,000?
That was 18 as well. So the Trans Wales race was kind of just a warm up. That was just a very low key, fun local event, and then the main event that year for me was the North Cape 4,000.
So this is Italy, Lake Como, I think, was it, to Nordkapp?
Yeah, Lake Garda. Yeah,
Lake Garda to Nordkapp, right at the northern point of Norway, 4,000 kilometers. And tell us about that. Tell us what happened there.
Well, I mean, the North Cape 4,000 is a really nice event. In many ways, quite similar to the Transcontinental, a sort of 4,000-ish kilometer self-supported race across Europe. The key difference between the two is that the Transcontinental just gives you checkpoints, and you've got a completely free reign of which route you take between checkpoints, whereas the North Cape 4,000 has a set route that everybody follows, which actually was kind of quite good for reducing stress. So, when you found yourself on a really bad road, you could think, oh, well, A, it's not my fault. It wasn't a routing error. And B, everyone else is in the same boat, so it doesn't matter. And so we set off from the north of Italy over the Alps on the first day. And then, it's another non-stop race. So the clock just starts at the start and stops when you get to Nordkapp. And it's up to you how long you ride, when you take a break, where you stop, where you find food, completely self-supported. And probably the two really notable things from my experience were, first, because of the nature of the race, they have a ferry crossing, or at least they did this year. So there was a ferry from Tallinn to Helsinki to get across the sea there. And that was one of the first things that really introduced a sort of air of absolute excitement to the whole thing, because a day beforehand, I'd managed to get into the lead of the race, and I had this amazing experience of like, right, okay, flipping heck. I'm in the lead. I never thought that would happen, but I've done it. Now I've got to hold on to this. And so two things happened. The first was I did this huge day's riding, sort of 750 kilometers or something like that, to just cement that lead, which was just the most mind-blowing experience. And it involved all sorts of stress with that ferry, because I remember riding through the middle of the night through Estonia, having to pre-book the ferry, because there was 3 different ferry companies that ran routes across the sea. They had to be pre-booked, which meant you had to take a punt on what time you thought you might get there. And I can remember sitting outside a petrol station at 2 a.m. on my phone going, oh my God, which one do I pick? Which one do I pick? What time do I reckon I'm going to get there? It's 200 kilometers away. And so I had this frantic race across Estonia, and then like 2 hours at the ferry port going, come on, ferry, come on, ferry. And then eventually I managed to get on it ahead of everyone else and get across to Finland first. And then that kind of kicked off the second really sort of thrilling and awful part of the race, which was I was in the lead for 1,000 miles, so 1,600 kilometers. And, I joked at the time it was a 1,000-mile breakaway, and it genuinely felt like that. You imagine seeing a rider in the Tour de France doing a solo breakaway, and then imagine doing that for 1,000 miles. That's what it felt like. Just that constant looking over your shoulder, worrying about the pack creeping up behind you, just digging really deep to try and stay ahead. And I learned so much about what it means to push yourself. Before that point, I'd never understood what it meant to really, really dig deep and go all out. But I made a decision there. I just thought, right, I've found myself in the lead of this race. I owe it to myself to do my absolute 100% best and I just discovered that you can dig down, find more, and keep going. But it was flipping hard work.
To what extent do you actually know where the others are when you're in the lead? I mean, you say, metaphorically, you look behind your shoulder. Obviously, you can do that in the Tour de France. You can't do that if they're hundreds of kilometers away. How do you keep a track of the other people?
Well, that's interesting. So nearly all of these kind of races use satellite trackers to update your position kind of every 5 or 10 minutes on a map. So everyone can look on their phone and see where everybody else is. Now, as it happens, things went a bit funny in the North Cape 4000. So the organisers there, for very good reasons, to kind of keep the costs low and make less barrier to entry, they'd arranged a system of tracking where if you had a satellite tracker, you could use it, and I did. But if you didn't have a satellite tracker, you could do the same thing using your phone. For your phone to send updates of your position every few minutes. The problem was, it meant that if anybody was doing that, and quite a few people were, first, if they went into a zone with no phone signal, then their position stopped updating. And also, if they just turned their phone off, it stopped updating. And a couple of people were doing that in what I think was quite a tactical way. So a couple of the people up near the front of the pack kept turning their phones off and not updating their positions. So that added to the stress of the whole thing so much, because at least with the rest of the riders, I could see where they were, do some mental calculations and say, okay, yeah, so I reckon he's 4 hours behind me, so I need to do this. And whereas the two who kept turning their trackers off, they would just sit there on the map, not moving for maybe 6 hours, and then suddenly jump a huge distance. And that made it so hard to know what they were doing. And so we knew where each other were, except for these ones who were kind of hiding their positions a bit, which, didn't help my mental state.
What month of the year was this in?
It was summer. I think it was either June, July, or July, August. I can't remember which one.
So you've got a really long days, and presumably you could. I mean, obviously you do need to sleep and eat and what have you, but presumably you could just keep on the bike for a long, long time in northern Norway to an extent that perhaps was more difficult further south.
Yeah, and I've got to say the midnight sun is so convenient for long distance riding. Just the fact you can just be riding at 2 or 3 in the morning and it's completely daylight is wonderful. The thing that took me by surprise was how cold it got. Even in the middle of summer, I was riding through sub-zero temperatures, and that caught me by surprise a bit. And I had one night in particular where it just got so cold. I had every single item of clothing on. I had my sleeping bag stuffed in my coat. I ended up, I stopped in a bus shelter and I found some old magazines, and I was ripping magazine pages and sticking them in my clothes and down my leg warmers. And, it was that cold that in the end, I just got driven off the road and just had to bunker down.
And you arrived at Nordkapp, and obviously you won that race. You did it in, I've written it down somewhere, 11 days, 10 hours and 43 minutes. Were you a favourite? Do they have such things as favourites? Were there people who were expected to do better, worse? And were people expecting you to be up there?
I don't think so. I think, again, it's like with most things in this ultra-distance cycling world, it's just a really low-key world. And I think every race that runs, a whole load of new people appear. So I don't think there is such a thing as the notion of favourites or outsiders particularly. I mean, there's a handful of names where if you saw them on the roster, you'd think, oh, they must have a chance. Fiona Colbing, Mark Hayden, people like that. So James Hayden, people like that. But apart from this handful of people who've got track record of winning things, you just see a whole load of names and you think, okay, right, well, there's a load of people here. Let's see what happens.
Do you think it is something? I mean, you're in your 40s. Is it something that is physiologically better suited to older people rather than perhaps people who are in their late teens and 20s? Do you think you're better your physiology is better suited to that kind of event when you are a little bit older, perhaps in your 30s and 40s?
It's a really interesting question, that. I remember a lot of discussion about that in the running world, because there was always this observation that you'd get people who would maybe be marathon runners in their 20s, who, as they started to slow down slightly, would come into ultramarathon and often do really well at it, because they'd be coming in with that great fitness and training from having done years of marathon, and then they had that opportunity to turn that to the ultra world and do well. I think what happened, the reason it's hard to answer definitively, is it's almost like we haven't had the controlled experiment. But that sort of thing happens a lot. You get loads of people who are fast runners or riders in their younger days who, as they start to slow, just naturally drift into ultra distance. But we've not got the counterexample. I don't think that there's enough 23-year-olds who are having a stab at ultra distance from the start for us to say, oh, older people's physiology suits it better, because we don't have the counterexamples of young people having a really good hard go at it to make the comparison. I think the other thing to consider is there's more than one thing that makes you good at ultra distance events. And actually, this is one of the reasons I really, really love the field. And one of the reasons I enjoy watching ultra distance races is the fact that there's more than one way to be good at it. So a person who's just got, say, raw physical power, obviously has some advantage. But that's not going to win. Like, for example, a really good example is that Nordkapp 4000 race. There were people in there who definitely were physically stronger than me, but they didn't come ahead of me. And it's because physical strength and just raw athletic ability, they're important, but they're not the only thing. You can compensate for that by being methodical, by being good at your timing, by being good at bike repairs, by being a great route planner, by having the ability to get by on less sleep. There's all these other skills or abilities that come into play. And obviously a person who's got everything will clean up. The person who's really disciplined and good at map reading and good at route planning and can get by on 3 hours sleep and has enormous physical strength, they're going to do great. But you can be good at it in lots of different ways.
Yeah, this is all fascinating stuff, and we haven't actually got to the bit that we need to talk about, which is the world record. So you've won the Nordkapp 4000. That was 2018. So you have your credentials, as it were, to move on and do something like the world record. When did you become aware of the fact that there was a world record to break? This is cycling between Nordkapp and Tarifa, the northernmost and southernmost points of Europe.
Well, what happened was I won that Nordkapp 4000, and I thought, right, I've got at least one more year, and I'm just going to go all out in this coming year. So this was sort of 2018 going into 2019. And I remember saying to my partner, look, I'm 44, as I was then. I'm 44. I've not necessarily got that much longer being at the top of this. So I want to just go absolutely all out and have a go at something next year where I hold nothing back whatsoever and go at it 100%. And so I went out and I found a coach, because I thought, I want to leave no stone unturned. I don't want to look back in 20 years and think, oh, I could have just done better if I'd done this extra thing. So I got a coach, but at that time, this was kind of autumn 2018. I didn't know what I was going to do. I vaguely was thinking maybe I'd enter the Transcontinental again, but whatever it was, I was going to do something, and I was going to do it really hard, but I didn't know what it was. So I found this coach, and then just as we first met, the coach is called Holly Sear, who's based over in Windsor, and we met for the first time. And just as we were talking, a few days earlier, I'd stumbled across the other Trans-Europe world record, which is the East to West record. And that had quite famously been broken by Sean Conway a couple of years earlier.
Yeah.
And then another rider called Lee Timmis broke it again in a supported ride. So I was kind of thinking of going for that, and I was planning to have a stab at breaking Lee Timmis's record, which I decided was just about achievable if everything went well. And so I floated this with my coach, with Holly, and we started talking about it and making a few plans. And then just out of the blue, as I was doing a bit of research and looking at the past records, I noticed the other one. I noticed the Nordkapp down to Tarifa record, and I thought, oh, okay, that might actually be better. And there were a couple of reasons. The first was the standing record felt a bit more achievable, so I had a bit more leeway in terms of the attempt. And the other thing that really made it appealing doing the north-south record was the Guinness records have to be 100% overland. You can't take ferries like I had the previous year. And so the east-west record was going to involve a lot of riding in Russia. And I was kind of nervous because everything I'd heard and read about riding in Russia suggested that the roads are pretty manky. And going to the north-south record, as well as having a bit more of a generous record to break, had this additional advantage that it was a lot less time in Russia. And so that also pushed me the other way.
Yeah, I've obviously got an interest in the Nordkapp Tarifa route because that's the one that I cycled back in 2015. Although I went from Tarifa to Nordkapp, and it took me over 100 days. So clearly I was doing it in a very, very different way to what you did. But thinking about it, for me, if I wanted, and I did want to cycle across a continent, for me, cycling from south to north, or perhaps north to south, is more of a crossing of a continent, especially Europe, when you think about the geography of Europe, than doing east to west. East to west is a bit of a, well, you start somewhere over in presumably Portugal and you finish kind of on the border with Russia, but it's in my mind it's a less defined thing. I actually quite like the idea, and it's far more appealing, that Tarifa Nordkapp route, simply because it has these two dead end points at which you need to connect.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And actually, I did mention that in the book about it, that, yeah, the east-west route, the eastern end is actually, sorry, the western end, so it is actually geographically satisfying. It is the western point in Europe, near Lisbon. And it juts out into the sea, and you can't go any further. It was the eastern end that was the problem, that the Guinness route ends in Ufa in the Urals, which is an eastern point, but there's nothing that makes you say, oh, well, this is the easternmost point. So that end felt a bit arbitrary. And that was another thing that made the north-south route more appealing, as well as the less Russian highways and more achievable record. That geographical satisfaction that you just described did also grab me.
Now, the other question, obviously, apart from the time it took us, the key difference was that we did it in different directions. What made you decide to do Nordkapp to Tarifa rather than Tarifa to Nordkapp?
A big part of it was just simply the logistics. I thought, well, when this ride finishes, I'm going to be pretty tired and I need to get home. And getting home from the south of Spain felt a bit more simple and achievable than getting home from the top of Norway.
Yeah, well, yeah, it certainly is. I'll agree with you there. Absolutely. So you've decided to do Nordkapp Tarifa. Presumably, what month of the year is this? Is it August?
July. Yeah. July. Oh no, sorry, no, that was the previous year. No, it was June. I set off on midday on Midsummer's Day.
Oh, right.
June.
Okay, so presumably that was purposefully chosen as midsummer, with it being the north of Norway.
Exactly. Yeah, I had to pick a time and date, and I knew I was going to do it in summer, so it just seemed kind of poetic to pick that time and date.
Okay, well, the best time to choose, simply because the length of the days there, just 24 hours up at Nordkapp. The route that you took, again, different from what I took. Mine was kind of a meander where I thought it'd be most interesting, and places that I hadn't necessarily been to before. Our routes are similar right at the north of Norway, and then our routes are actually quite similar in Spain. a lot of people who do the route, they follow the coast in Spain, but we didn't. We kind of went up what I think of as the Via de la Plata, and then across northern Spain, and you did that in reverse. But the rest of the journey, yours is far more to the east than mine. How did you go about determining that route in the first place?
Well, a lot of time went into staring at maps. And I was trying to make the trade-off between a bunch of different things that would affect my time. Time was the number one concern, to the extent that the route ended up slightly longer than it could have been, but I believed faster. So obviously flat was an important thing. I tried to avoid as much climbing as possible, although Spain contains a surprising amount of up and down.
Yeah.
Avoiding cities as much as possible, because my experience is that going through a city is worse than going over a mountain for eating into your time, whilst at the same time trying to find enough places I could buy food and drink along the way. So that's one of the trade-offs. Distance, flatness, resources without going through cities, places where I could stop in my journey if I needed to. I was weighing up all of those things and just trying to find the best compromise, really.
So in the end, it was 6,387 kilometers in 16 days, 20 hours and 59 minutes, which works out an average of 377 kilometers per day. And it was an unsupported ride. There was nobody following you in a van or anything like that?
That's right. Yeah. And that was actually, so I'm going to stoke my ego a little bit here. That was actually my little secret unspoken challenge to myself. So I had the whole thing arranged, and the plan had been, if everything had gone completely according to what I wanted, then I would have been doing about 400 kilometers a day. Now, my backup plan, my sort of plan B, was to do more than 370 kilometers a day, because that's what the east to west record was supported. And so I had this little secret ambition that I told nobody, not even my partner, which was I would be so happy if I could do more than 370 kilometers a day unsupported, because that way I could definitely say I was the fastest person riding across Europe.
Yeah. And I spoke to Mark Beaumont earlier last year during the first lockdown, and I was surprised. He told me that actually the Guinness World Record people, they make no distinction between supported and unsupported world records, because when he went round the globe for the second time, it was very much supported, but in effect he was trying to break the same record that he'd broken all those years before when he first did it unsupported.
Yeah, and obviously I've thought about this quite a lot. I think in a sense it's disappointing, because obviously doing an unsupported ride is very different to doing a supported ride. And there were times where, the idea of having somebody find my food for me and massage my legs. And I mean, I've read Mark Beaumont's book about riding around the world, and there are bits in there that almost made me weep with jealousy, where he's saying things like, oh, it was quite a flat day today, so the mechanic changed the cassette on my bike, or this day we decided to go for such and such a tires because the road surface was bad, and that would have been so nice. So the demands of supported unsupported are so incredibly different, but at the same time I can completely understand it from Guinness's perspective. They're trying to maintain a fairly clean, pure set of records, and how could you actually prove it that you did something completely unsupported?
Yeah, that was the point that Mark made. He just said, you cannot. Where do you define supported and unsupported? It's a minefield, but probably one that a lot of people are not aware of. Should they be considering breaking your record?
And I think there was something when we did the Transcontinental at the start of it. They showed us a little video that Mike Hall had made before he died, where he explained what he saw as the key here. And I think this has really stuck with me as a useful guide, which is the thing that was forbidden in the Transcontinental is any help that comes because you are you. So if a stranger just meets you in the street and decides to give you something, that's fine, because they'd have given that to somebody else. if somebody else had happened to come along at that point. Whereas if a person comes out to meet you, that's help.
And that would presumably disqualify you from the races.
Yeah.
Thinking back to when I did Tarifa to Nordkapp, clearly for me, the cycling is important. I enjoy the cycling, but I also enjoy the fact that you can rock up in a little town, sit in a cafe, have a chat with the locals, have a glass of wine, eat a baguette. I'm kind of fantasizing now in my kind of in my cycling.
Yeah.
But that in the back of my mind is kind of the ultimate thing for me, is just to kind of have that experience. For people who've done what you're doing, I'm not going to presume, does that exist? Are you able to enjoy it as a traveling experience just as much as a physical endurance experience?
No, basically. Like I went into all of these events, the transcontinental, well, not so much the transcontinental, but especially the North Cape 4000 and the Cross Europe record. I went into those saying to myself, I want to do well at this. I've set myself the challenge of doing this as fast as possible, and I'm going to take that seriously. And I know that's not for everybody, but that's what I decided to do. And because I'd set myself the challenge of riding fast, I went into it knowing that means you can't sit around enjoying a glass of wine with the locals. It means that if you're waiting for that baguette, you're going, come on, will this baguette ever bloody arrive? And it becomes a completely different experience. And I know, I've spoken to people who hate the idea of doing what I did there, who just see it as an absolute lost opportunity to ride through France and not stop in cafes. And I can relate to that, and I know what they mean. But at the same time, if you've set out and you said, well, the reason I'm doing this is to be fast, then you realize there are sacrifices that come with that. And yet there are also huge gains. And one of the gains is that it goes back to that kind of mental freedom that we touched on earlier, that if you set out and said, well, I'm going to ride from here to there as fast as possible, and that is the only thing that's going to drive every single decision I make today, that is actually incredibly liberating. There's a freedom that comes with that. Maybe you've ridden through a village and you're like, oh, that cafe looks nice. Should I stop there? Or maybe that cafe over there. I don't have those quandaries. I just keep going. And, there's that. There is a freedom and a liberation that comes from putting yourself in a position where all your options are taken away from you. And trying to go fast does that.
Yeah, I think there is a joy in just cycling a long distance, and I've done it on a few of the rides that I've done, on a few of the days of those rides, because of circumstances, and it's usually because you find yourself in a mood which isn't brilliant, and you just want to move on and make some distance, or perhaps it's because you can't find a campsite or whatever. And I have ended up cycling a phenomenally long distance. I mean, I think the longest was it was over 200 kilometers when I was cycling along the coast of Spain back in 2013. And I did enjoy that. Looking back, I did thoroughly enjoy that experience of just being on the bike and pushing myself and keeping going and keeping going and keeping going. And it was just as enjoyable as those days where you cycle 30, 40, 50 kilometers and seem to spend most of the day just sitting around looking at the landscape and eating baguettes.
And this is one of the beauties of cycling. This is one of the beauties of riding a bike, that you can choose. You can have both or either of those, as suits your mood. And the bike is a very, very flexible device that can reward people in lots of different ways.
Yeah. How do you define the northernmost point and southernmost, or rather, how did Guinness define it? Where is the point? And the reason I ask is because when you get to Nordkapp, where that statue is, where the sculpture is of the globe at Nordkapp, that's not actually the northernmost point of the continent, is it? And likewise, when you get to Tarifa, the end of the causeway actually is connected to the island where there's the military bit. Where did Guinness say you've got to start and finish?
Guinness say the northernmost point is the entrance to the visitor centre at Nordkapp. And so for people who haven't been there, which I imagine is most people listening to this, the road ends. There's kind of a car park. The road, you get to the end of the road, literally the end of the road. There's a car park. The visitor centre is in front of you, and then you walk round the visitor centre, and there's a sculpture out back, maybe 50 metres, 50 metres behind the visitor centre. And then there's another short distance of, I don't know, 10 metres or so, and then the cliffs drop into the sea, and that is it. So technically, the starting point outside the visitor centre entrance is maybe 50 metres from the very, very end of the continent, but it's the end of the road, which I think is the reason it's chosen. It's the furthest you could travel by road in Europe. And I think the same is at the southern end. So the southern end is defined as the causeway from Tarifa to the military island at the end. So again, it's as far as one is permitted to travel in Europe.
Right, okay. Because when I did it, I actually made an effort to get onto the island, and eventually they did let me on, and I kind of went off down to the southern bit. So I'm very proud of the fact that I did start from what I consider the real southern bit of Europe. But then when I got to Nordkapp, I seem to have lost my enthusiasm for doing this, because when you get to Nordkapp, there is that little bit. There's another peninsula just to the west of Nordkapp, isn't there? Which actually is slightly further north. And you can walk on there. I think you could probably push a bike down there as well. But, after all those thousands of kilometres, I thought, oh, sod this.
And so, one can physically get a bit further. But like I say, I think the records have been based around where the roads end.
Yeah. And if you were, you might refuse to answer this, but if you were to give some advice to somebody who wanted to break your record, what would it be?
Oh, well, loads of things. And I would if someone came to me and said, I want to have a go at breaking it, I'd be more than happy to help them because, and again, one of the things I talk about at some length in my book is that the breaking a record isn't the good bit. Breaking a record isn't exhilarating, or at least it wasn't for me. For me, breaking a record was just a relief that nothing had gone wrong along the way. The good bit is the 6-12 months of preparation and training beforehand. That's the great bit. And so I'd help anybody who wants to have a go. There's loads of advice. There's sort of big advice and small advice. And the big stuff is about the mental preparation, I think, because I'm a huge fan of that old joke about ultra distance running and riding, that it's 90% mental and the other 10% is in your head. It's not really about your physical ability. It's whether you do well or whether you even finish a long ride. It's all down to your expectations and your ability to handle hardship. Because if you ride all day and then do it again the next day and do it again the next day, things will go wrong. You will have bad times. You will go through points of feeling unbelievably low, and it's just possible, in fact it's quite probable, that some of those periods of feeling very bad will coincide with passing railway stations where you can bail out. And so it's having the fortitude and the mental strategies to cope with the bad side. Part of that comes from experience, and part of it comes from anticipation and planning and working through. So a huge part of my advice would be about practicing and planning for the worst and readying yourself for when it gets hard, because it will get hard. And then otherwise, I'd have all sorts of specific advice about route planning. Route planning is a difficult one for something like this, because you have to make trade-offs in terms of what you're comfortable with. If you want to go fast, which is what I was aiming for, then there is unfortunately a price to be paid for that, which means you have to go on some bigger roads. The fast roads are the big roads in most cases. And so I spent a lot of time, especially across the Baltic states and Poland and places like that. I spent a lot of time on really quite substantial highways with a lot of trucks and cars. And that made the journey less safe, to be honest. But that was one of the trade-offs I had to make for speed.
What do you think is the minimum time you could do it in? I mean, you did it in nearly 17 days, 16 days, 20 hours, 59 minutes. Do you think it would be possible to do it in 14 days?
I think you could approach that if everything went well. I think, well, I mean, so there's two key facets I'd say here. The first is I had the most appalling headwinds. I had like a week or more across Central Europe. So all of Lithuania, Poland, all of Germany, most of France. I had the most shocking headwinds just from the start of the day till the end of the day, grinding into these gale force headwinds. At times I was struggling to do 20 kilometers an hour on the flat, just, painful, agonizing, just completely focused on the next lamppost. Riding 400 kilometers, one lamppost at a time. And it was unbelievably hard work. So if you were lucky with the wins, then I reckon you've shaved a day off already. And then maybe if you had an amazing support crew and you responded well to being supported, that might shave some time off as well.
Yeah. Do you know of anybody who is planning to do it?
No, I don't. I mean, basically, things have kind of fallen out quite well for me in a horrible way, because obviously you can't have a go at the moment with COVID restrictions.
Yeah.
And then my plan then is to start a new Cold War so that nobody's allowed into Russia, and then I can keep the record for as long as I want.
Yeah. Well, that's one kind of positive way of looking at the current lockdown. So what is next after lockdown 3 finishes? Are you going to return to the sofa and eat crisps and drink beer, or are you going to keep this up and are you going to challenge yourself again, or are you going to retire?
That's kind of up in the air at the moment. I mean, technically, I've got a place in the Trans-America race rolled over from last year, which got postponed. I'd be very surprised if that goes ahead this year, just with COVID and so on. So things are still up in the air. Yeah, this is a little bit of an aside, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Earlier on in lockdown, I tried to set myself a different challenge. I thought, I've got all this fitness and experience, but we're locked down. We can't really go far from home. And I decided I'd try an interesting challenge of, could I ride 3,000 kilometers in a week without going more than 25 kilometers from home? And so I set out early in the morning and just started riding, and I just did loops, and at every junction, I'd just go, which way do I feel like turning? I feel like turning right, I'll do that. And I just went round and round and round. And every sort of 100 kilometers or so, I'd drop back home, grab a bite to eat, clean my teeth, back on the bike, go and do another 50 or 100 kilometers. And I thought, this would be great. I'll easily clock up 3,000 kilometers this way without going anywhere. And then I gave up on the second day. And then a few weeks later, I had another go, and I gave up on the second day. And what was interesting was how unbelievably hard it was to ride 400 kilometers a day when I had nowhere to head for. When the riding just became purposeless and I didn't have a destination, then suddenly these distances that I knew I could do became really, really, really hard. And so it was one of the most interesting explorations and interesting discoveries about the importance of having a destination for riding. And it really brought home how riding for its own sake can be quite unsatisfying. There needs to be a destination, at least for me. So that's quite a long answer of saying, I know I've nothing on the horizon at the moment, but I learned something very interesting when I tried to set myself something as a challenge for this year.
Yeah, but that also connects with what we were saying earlier about the fact that cycling Tarifa to Nordkapp or Nordkapp to Tarifa, you do have a fixed point in your mind and you're frequently thinking about it. You've seen images of it. You might have been there before in your case. Whereas that east-west route, well, you kind of have a nondescript town in Russia to think about in the Urals, where there's nothing really there which says or shouts, yes, this is the edge of Europe. I think that's why I like these point-to-point cycles, because you do have that point to aim at. And it does, you're right, it keeps you going. Just to cycle endlessly without a destination in mind, I think, well, I don't think I would enjoy that at all.
Yeah, well, as I found twice, I just quit on day 2 because you're sore, you're tired, your neck aches, and you think, what is the purpose of this when I'm not actually going somewhere?
Yeah. No, that is, of all the talks I've done on these podcasts, I think, the last hour has been one of the most interesting, because it's an area of cycling that I hold in great reverence, because I don't think it's something I would ever be able to do. I mean, in fact, I'm certain I would never be able to do it myself, just in terms of the level of fitness that is required. But I take my hat off to people like you and Emily Chappell and Mike Hall, when he was around, who do these things, and they are amazing things to achieve. So well done.
Oh, thank you.
And we haven't even touched on your academic stuff. And don't worry, I'm not going to go down that route now. But the academic side of your life, when it comes to cycling, is equally fascinating. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you're the man who I remember reading about years ago, who cycled round Bath or Bristol with a long blonde wig on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. It wasn't blonde, but otherwise, yes, that was me back in sort of 2006. Where I spent a few weeks riding around. The wig was a sort of follow-up thing. So mostly I was measuring other things. I was measuring riding position on the road and whether wearing a helmet made a difference and things like that. And the wig was a little follow-up experiment where because so many people kept saying, do you think it would change do you think drivers treat men and women differently, basically? And I asked around to see if I could find a woman to do any riding, and no one volunteered. I dropped some really heavy hints and nobody took the bait. So in the end, I bought this long dark wig and spent some time riding up and down a road. So I'd ride up the road, stick the wig on, ride back down the road, take the wig off, and collected distance measurements from all these drivers with and without. And luckily, what was good with that is later on, some other research teams tried it with real men and women and found the same results I did, which is kind of always nice when that happens.
Yeah, the people who lived on that road must have thought, what's that bloke doing? He keeps cycling up and down, what with a wig and without a wig. Well, the thing that probably made it particularly funny if anyone spotted me was because, of course, it was all about signaling to the drivers behind as they approached for overtakes. So, but the reason it probably looked particularly strange is that I had a beard at the time as well. So if you saw me from the front, then suddenly there was this transition from a quite feminine look behind to this bearded chap at the front, which must have been very strange to people. A very clever thing to do in terms of getting publicity, because that's presumably why it made the newspapers, because you stuck a wig on.
Well, do you know, the bit that actually got all the publicity wasn't that. That was always mentioned at the side. The bit that got all the attention was the finding that drivers got a bit closer when I wore a helmet. And that's the bit of that study that still rattles on all these years later, because a lot of people don't like that finding very much.
Yeah. Oh God, we could talk, seriously, we could talk for another hour about this, because I think it's fascinating stuff. Perhaps I should go and read some of your academic papers, but just to finish off with, the book that you wrote about the cycle is called Endless Perfect Circles, and presumably that's available on Amazon, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Most bookshops should be able to get it. Amazon have it in stock. And I've got to say, although obviously I would say this, I'm really happy with the book. I think it works on a lot of different levels. I think for people who are interested in having a go at long distance riding, then obviously there's a huge amount in here for you. There's stuff on the mental side, but there's also loads of practical advice. But what's been really gratifying is a load of non-cyclists have been extremely positive about reading it. And actually quite a lot of people have, people who don't do any sort of cycling at all, they found they've almost been treating it like a self-help book, because like I say, to ride for long distances is a mental game. It's about coping. It's about dealing with hardship. And because I talk about that quite a bit, people have got in touch with me and said things like, this has helped me deal with personal problems because I've been employing those same strategies that you talk about, and it's got me through some difficult times. So that's been the really gratifying thing about putting this out there.
Where does the title come from? Endless Perfect Circles?
It's something I just find myself thinking about when I'm riding. Sometimes when I'm riding and I'm just in the zone, I just sort of fall into this almost meditative state of comfort and being at one with the activity. And I just get this feeling of my feet going round in these endless circles, and the wheels go round in their endless circles. And it just feels like there's this sense of flow and continuity through my body, through the bike, through the road. And so the title was an attempt to try and capture that.
No, I haven't read it myself yet, but I'll certainly get hold of a copy and have a read, because it does. If it's anything like the conversation we've just had in the past hour, it will be a fascinating read.
Oh, it's even better than this.
Okay, well, thanks for talking to me.
Oh, thank you so much for the invite.